This is the Town of Washington Historical Society meeting on March 19, 1998. The meeting is being held at the Lyall Memorial Federated Church in Millbrook, and Carmine de Arpine is going to tell us the history of the Lyall Memorial Federated Church.
You still have enough patience to listen? Well, this is unusual for me, and at the same time very, very usual and comfortable, because I'm a member of this church. Have been for some time. I came to Millbrook in 1953 to teach at the Greer School, and then in 1959 I moved over to Bennett. They asked me to write a history of this town, which I did for the first edition in 1975 and the second edition in 1988. But that's besides the point. We are to talk tonight about this church. And this is the most difficult for history or for a historian of all the churches in the town, because it isn't a single church of a single denomination, but it is a combined church. It started out with the three denominations, and now it is general Protestant. But let us begin at the beginning. The beginning of this church is really with the Quakers, believe it or not. And it goes back to before there was a Millbrook, before there was a town of Washington. There were only a few hamlets in the area, and it was being still settled. The Quakers came here very, very early, about 1740. And they built a church soon after that, that is a meeting place rather than a church. They did not call it a church. Now, to do a detailed history from that time on will take a lot more time than we're allotted here. So we'll have to skip over a few things and go on with the essentials. Now, they began, as I say, about 1740. They came from Nantucket. They came from Long Island. They came from what is now Brooklyn. They came from several places and found their way here, up the trails from Route 22, from New England, and up the river, the Hudson River, and then over on the rough roads of the time. And the first settlement was about where Little Rest is now. And then from there they moved a little bit more westward and settled permanently where they built their meeting house. And that was at the end of what is now Church Street and 343, Route 343. There's a cemetery there. That was their cemetery originally. And that brick house, that brick building which is there, was their meeting house or church, if you will. But before that, there was much more to be said. When they first arrived here, early in the 1740s, they were still members of the meeting house down in Westchester. And then from there, for a while, they were part of the meeting house in Oblong, down in Pauling. And then eventually, they built one here. And the first one that they built was a log cabin, about where the cemetery is now at 343 and Church Street. There was no Church Street then. There was only a road which went from Dover across, zigzagging across the hills and valleys to the river, to Poughkeepsie. So they built a log cabin church, and it burned down. So in 1780, they built that brick meeting house, which is now in a cemetery at the corner of Church Street and 343. They were Quakers, or Friends was the proper name. They've just begun now to accept the name Quaker, I understand, because that was a nickname that they gave them, because when they prayed, they presumably shook. Whether that was true or not, I'm not sure. I wasn't there then. But they were called Quakers by everyone else except by themselves. And they had that meeting house. That's one of the portions or the part of this church. or it would be eventually. It was not then. Another part of this church was the Reformed Church. The Reformed Church was originally located in Switzerland. And it's about the same as the Presbyterian, if you're acquainted with it, by structure and so on. They have a session of the church to run it. They have elders, they have deacons, the same as the Presbyterian Church, about the same. And they located in what is now an abandoned court, tennis court on Route 343 and Halcyon Road, across from Bennett College. The church there was built by a man by the name of George Brown. He was a businessman. His brother was an elder in a church near the Hudson in Manhattan. They were quite well established. And he eventually built up an estate here in Millbrook from what is now Route 343 all the way back to that road which goes from 343 down and comes out on 343 again. It did not have the name it does now then. And he eventually controlled a large amount of property, that whole area from that road 343 back to the other, and all the way from the four corners almost, all the way down to Shettydale Lane. Now, he built that church. He donated the money. See that plaque on the wall there came from there, and it has on there the information about when the church was built, about 1866 it was opened. And it was, in the beginning, just a church. Then they decided to go with the Reformed Church. And they organized and they applied and they were accepted, and the church was begun, went into operation about 1866. Now, that's the second part of this church. So you see it goes all the way back to a log cabin back in the 1740s, then the 1860s. And the third church, which is a part of it originally, was the Methodist Church. Now, Methodist Church was originally, it came from the Armenia area, and they built a church in 1840s, which is now a restaurant in Lithgow. That was originally a Methodist church. And then they moved over to Hart's Village, back here, which is now part of Millbrook. And they had a church there for a while, and eventually in 1886 they built one here in Millbrook, which is on Church Street and is now the home of the man who is in charge of streets and roads in the village of Millbrook. That makes his home. They sold it to him when this church was built. Now, those are the three that organized to form this church. And it was done in 1923, 24. It was eventually built and dedicated in 1926. All right, now, the man who named the church bears, Lyall Memorial Church, was minister of the Reformed Church for 42 years, all the way until 1921 when he resigned, and in 1922 later, and shortly thereafter he died. And he is buried in a cemetery on the corner of Church Street and 343, which is now a general Protestant cemetery, no longer just Quaker or just Friends. And there's a monument there for Lyall, Reverend Lyall. Now, that's a long time to be the minister of a church, 42 years. At that time, they did that, especially those churches. Not like the Methodists. The Methodists, on the other hand, 3 years, presumably, but sometimes it's a little longer, and they keep moving and changing. Lyall was here a long, long time. So those were the three churches that originally formed the Lyall Memorial Church. And it happened after Lyall died. Actually, when he was still alive and before he resigned from this church, there has already been some talk or some movement about congregating together to get all of the churches, all the Protestant churches in Millbrook to form one church. Now at that time that was done, and it was necessary, because a small church in a small hamlet simply didn't have enough people to survive, to stay alive financially, and to be able to hire a clergyman and pay his salary and keep. So that what they did, they began to unite. As soon as transportation became easier, they began to unite as many churches as they could in a given community into one. This was created the Lyall Memorial Federated Church. It was a federation of 3 churches originally. Right now, in addition to that, to those problems in those days, there were others as well. For instance, the Reformed Church of South Millbrook, which is part of this now, started 2 other churches. One on what is now Route 88, which goes up to Pine Plains, and there was a cotton mill there, and there were workers in a cotton mill, so they built a chapel there. It is now a Baptist church. And the building itself, which they built, no longer exists. They tore it down, they built a new one. The other church built by the Reformed Church was one in Mebbetsville, which is no longer there either. And those 2 were eventually eliminated because it became impossible to really maintain them and hire ministers and so on. So from 1926 on, this church was dedicated in 1926. And from then on, it was one church. By the way, when they decided to federate, all that there are 3 Protestant churches, they also invited Grace Church, which is Episcopalian and is in Millbrook. They declined. They did not want to join. They decided to remain as they were. But the other 3, the Methodist, the Reformed, and the Quaker, united and formed this church. Now, how was it governed? How did they do that when all these different Protestant churches with different traditions became one? Well, it was done in a very interesting way. They retained their own identity. And they had a board which operated the church, financed and so on, whatever needed to be done. And we had an equal number of people from each of the congregations on the board. And then each of the congregations also had their own organization. They met regularly. There were 3 members from the Baptist, from the Quakers, 3 from the Methodist, and 3 from the Reformed that originally formed the board of the Lyall Memorial Federated Church. And it was that way for a long time. They used to meet. First, the 3 congregations met separately with their own organization, and then they got together and had their annual meeting for the entire church. Now, there were some problems when they did that, because each congregation retained its own ways, its own traditions, and they couldn't be, for instance, like the Reformed Church or Presbyterian, with a session that is elders and deacons and so on, because not all of them had such officers. For instance, in the Methodist Church, if you are a Methodist, you know that there are no elders. The elders are the clergy, and no deacons. And obviously the Quakers did not have such. So they couldn't have the same kind of organization for the entire church. And it operated that way for a long time. It operated that way until very recently, 1985, when they decided to do something about it, because people who joined the church, general Protestants of all kinds of backgrounds, would come to Millbrook to live, and they were looking for a church, and they would come here, and they were placed in one of the 3. The one that was closest to their own background. For instance, when I came here to join this church, they put me in a Reformed church, because it was the closest one to Presbyterian. And so it was done that way. There was no such a thing then as now as a membership at large. So in about 1985, they decided to change it because there were so many different people in the congregation who were from either of those three. They were from different backgrounds entirely. And so what they did was to reorganize everything. Now there are no longer separate groupings or governments for the three original congregations. They don't have them anymore. What we have now is two boards, actually one board, but two sections. The Board of Spiritual Life, which takes care of all the religious, sacramental, theology, everything that has to do with worship, Sunday school, the Board of Spiritual Life. And then there's a Board of Trustees who handle all of the business of the church and everything else. And the others are eliminated, the other three. The one for the Quakers, one for the Methodists, and one for the Reformed. So the church is now one. You no longer have to be placed in one of those three. If you join the church now, you join it now, you can be a member at large. Just a member of the church. You don't have to be a Reformed or a Friend, Quaker, or a Methodist. If you are such, you can still remain so, but there's no longer a separate organization for your denomination in the church. There's only one church now. And this is since about 1985. It has been that way. Now, there are a number of things that this church has done and does. For instance, it has a very, very active Sunday school, always has had. At one time when I first came here, we even had some people from the Roman Catholic Church, St. Joseph, who used to sing in a junior choir here in this church. It has always been a cooperative community. I'll give you an example. Ever since the 1920s, at Christmas time, the three churches of Millbrook, St. Joseph, the Methodist Church, the Episcopal Church, and this one had community hymn singing at Christmas time. And they alternated from church to church every year. When they came here, for instance, they sang right out here, and they asked that the window be opened so that they could hear the organ being played. And this was going on long before the Ecumenical Council, long before Pope John, long before the cooperation which we have now. It's always been an unusual community here in Millbrook for churches and religion. Now, a number of other things have also been done. They've always cooperated from the beginning. There never was any fighting or whatever. And now, since the Ecumenical Council of Pope John and since the reorganization, there is a very, very close relationship between the three churches of Millbrook. Grace Church, St. Joseph, and this one. We just don't have just hymn singing at Christmas time anymore. We have a little more than that. We even, at Easter time, right now, we have ecumenical services on Sunday night. And we go from church to church. The next one is going to be here. And I don't remember who the preacher is, but he is from another church who will preach on that night. So that Millbrook has been an unusual religious community from way back when. There has never been that animosity, that fighting, and so on. Of course, some individuals may have antipathy one for the other, and so on and so on. But this church today is a community church. Anyone of Protestant background who wants to join the church may do so as an associate member. He doesn't have to be a Methodist or a Quaker or a Reformed anymore. I'm still registered, I believe, in a Reformed church here because it was the closest one to Presbyterian, as I've said. But it doesn't matter to me. It doesn't mean anything. I'm a member of the Lyall Memorial Federated Church. And I do my work here, whatever they ask me to do that I'm able to do. My first connection here was in the 1950s when I was teaching at the Greer School up on the hill in Burbank across the border. They asked me to take the minister's place when he was on vacation in the summer. And I preached from that pulpit. At that time, this was different. It was not as it is now. This was solid. There was no center aisle. And the choir sat facing the congregation in tiers, one behind the other, a little higher than the front one. And it was quite an experience for me to do that. Then about 1960, 59, Miss Lamont was the daughter of a man who had been a Secretary of War in Washington. They had the estate, the Altamont estate on Route 343, and she had it changed. See, the choir was moved on both sides, a center aisle was put in, and so on. So this last change was made about 1959-60, when the church is as it is now. Now also, Miss Lamont donated that wing of the church on the far side, the kitchen, the big living room, minister's office, the classrooms upstairs for Sunday school. It was supposed to be an anonymous donation. Nobody was supposed to know, but everybody did. That Miss Lamont had given it as a gift. So it's an unusual type of church, different from many that I had known before. And I've been very, very happy that I joined and am still a member thereof. Now, are there any questions that I may be able to answer? I'm not sure that I can answer anything you ask, but shoot. Yes?
Could you explain those photographs you have over there?
Yeah. This was the Quaker Orthodox Church, which was located in the library parking lot. And in 1970, of course, when this church was federated, and the Quakers and the Methodists and the Reformed joined into one, they had to dispose of the old buildings, churches. The Reformed Church in South Millbrook, where those abandoned tennis courts are now, went to Bennett College. The Bennett people bought it and eventually tore it down. The Quaker Church, which was then located in a library parking lot, was made into the Knights of Columbus meeting hall. And in 1970, it was torn down to make room for the parking lot for the library. And this is a photograph of the process of tearing down the church and removing it. This here, you can come up and look later, are the three churches which were organized into the Federated. There is the Quaker, the Reformed. By the way, the Reformed Church had a steeple which was 175 feet high. And it was the largest of the churches in Millbrook. These benches that you're sitting on and the pulpit came from there. And they were moved here. And the other, there's a mistake here. This was put together by Lyall Memorial Church. They have the present day meeting house, which is still there, the brick house, in a cemetery on the corner of 343 on Church Street. That is not the one that joined with this. The one that joined with this was the one in the library parking lot, that one. So this is a mistake here. Now, the Quakers, as you know, split into two, as I already mentioned, in about 1828. And this went to the Hicksites and the school here, and went to the Orthodox Quakers, that is the original ones, and they are the ones who built this one, which was then moved to Millbrook from there, and eventually torn down. And they're the ones who joined the Lyall Church, not the Hicksites. Now, it may be interesting to you to know that the Thorne family were originally Quakers, and they came here from New York City, Brooklyn actually, and they made their way up and they bought an estate right there where the cemetery is, and it's from there They participated in the Quaker Church until 1828. Then they became Hicksites rather than with the Orthodox. I'm glad you came in. As our pastor, we will expect you to say a few words to these people of welcome. I have covered most of the history of how we came to be and how we changed it in 1985, so that it's no longer now necessary to join or to be a Methodist or Reformed or a Quaker to be a member of this church. You can be a member at large. We've covered all of that. I'm just answering questions now. Yes.
There's another question, Carmine. There's a Methodist church down in Burbank. Was that connected with the Methodist church in Millbrook at all?
Was there a Methodist church?
There is a Methodist church in Burbank at the present time, which
Yes.
has been there for a while.
Yes, it's there.
Was that connected with the Methodist church
No,
in Millbrook at all?
That one came from the river end in Poughkeepsie. The one in Lithgow came from Armenia. They were both Methodist, but they came from different directions with a different origin. Now, the one that came to Millbrook, that I said, first came to Hart's Village, and they had a church there, and then they moved to Millbrook and built the one that was on Church Street, which is now the home of the men in charge of streets and so on, and roads in Millbrook. That was built in 1886. And then eventually, those people of the church in Lithgow moved to Hart's Village and then joined Millbrook. The church in Lithgow was still in operation. Now, when this church was built, after it was dedicated in 1926, then the congregation from Lithgow joined this church. And that one was sold to Bundekin and eventually became a restaurant. And it's still a restaurant now with different ownership. Any other questions? Yes.
I just want to tell a little story about the Knights of Columbus Hall. Picture in the upper left
Yeah.
of when it was being taken down. And I didn't know when it was. I see 1970.
You remember that? It's not too long
I
ago.
didn't live in the area here at the time.
1970.
Next door to the Knights of Columbus Hall is the White House, Victoria. Family that lives there now, the name is O'Keefe. And the family that lived there before was Francis J. Dean. And his daughter, Joan Dean, still my close friend, who now lives in Lakeland, Florida. And Francis Dean, you all know the Dean store, which is now Marona's Market.
Yes.
Joan was at her family's home at the time before this happened, around this time when it got torn down. And at Joan's home in Lakeland, Florida right now, in the backyard, around her trees, big white rock, this big, that she stole from Knights of Columbus grounds before they plowed them all away. And Phoenix lived next door, and she's going back down Lakeland, Florida, and and she wanted that stone in her backyard in Lakeland, Florida. So that's my little story.
Right.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions?
Glad to have you.
If not, I would ask the pastor of this church, the Reverend Esmart, who is in the back, to come up and say a few words.
First of all, I apologize for coming and going. I can only catch people at certain times, it seems, so I had to make a couple of calls. And so that being completed, I'd like to say welcome, and I hope you enjoy your visit here with us. I'm sure Carmine has told you a great deal about the history of the church. We have done many things over the years, and it's my hope that in the future there will be many more things left to do. You all come from various parishes, I'm sure, around the area, and one of the things this congregation has tried to do is to be involved in ecumenical kinds of work, which is to say that if you're here tonight, on Sunday night, there's going to be a Lenten service here, like you all pointed out. The work here in this church, but of course the Nine Partners Meeting House. We've done more with that recently. Expect to do more with that. Again this summer between the months of May and September, if you would like to come to a Quaker meeting, we have those at 9 o'clock in the Meeting House now. We began those last year, I think. That was the first time in 70 years that we had reinstituted the Quaker meeting services there. And we also are beginning to use the Little Rest Chapel for different kinds of activities, as you may know or have heard. And so between the three of them, we're trying to keep busy and certainly trying to create more history for you to worry about and study. So thank you all. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Carl. I would like to make a comment, and one is that I'm a member of the Grace Church, but I feel comfortable talking to both Father O'Connor and Carl at any time about anything. So I think it is terrific the way the churches in Millbrook work together, and I hope that continues, and I encourage everybody to participate. We've had a meeting at the Quaker Meeting House, and we've had a meeting at Little Rest, and the presentation that we got from Amy at the Little Rest Chapel we were so impressed that the Rotaries asked her to give it again, so we'll have another meeting this summer at the chapel. So anyway, thank you, and Pat, you want to lead us? No. We have some refreshments in the back. So if everybody would like to go back to it.